In this training film, we'll discuss two components, the JB0 and the JB1 manual transaxles found on the Renault Alliance and Encore models. Because these transaxles are used extensively on the Renault line, it's important that you familiarize yourself with them so you can service them properly. This film will be divided into two areas. First, we'll take a look at some of the important design features of the JB0 and JB1 transaxles. Then we'll cover the procedures you should follow for disassembling and servicing them. Let's begin with a look at the design features. The transaxle type, suffix, and fabrication number are stamped on an identification plate, which is held in place by one of the clutch housing bolts. You should refer to the information on this plate when ordering parts or determining specifications because there are some differences. The JB0 is a 4-speed manual transaxle and the JB1 is a 5-speed. Both transaxles are fully synchronized in all forward gears. The major construction difference between the JB0 and the JB1 is, of course, the addition of the 5th gear components on the JB1. These transaxles are basically non-adjustable. The principal internal components are the primary shaft, the reverse shaft, and the secondary shaft. The primary shaft can't be repaired or adjusted. It is serviced only as a unit. Notice that the primary shaft is supported at each end by a bearing. Also note that the primary shaft used on the JB1 has an oil passage for the 5th gear. Like the primary shaft, the reverse shaft can't be repaired or adjusted. It too must be serviced as a unit. The reverse gear is included on replacement reverse shafts. The secondary shaft can be disassembled for servicing. Each component may be removed, inspected, and replaced as necessary. Notice that the secondary shaft is supported at each end by a bearing. Also note the location of the oil passage. The transmission case and differential housing are made of aluminum. If the housing is damaged, it will have to be replaced. The case bearings, however, are serviceable. On the JB0 and JB1 transaxles, it's important to note the location of the oil filler plug because it varies. On some models, the oil filler plug is located here, as shown on the left. On these models, the breather plug, as shown on the right, must be removed to drain or fill the transaxle effectively. When checking or adding lubricant, the oil level should be flush with the edge of the filler hole. On other models, the oil filler plug is located as shown. It is not necessary to remove the breather plug to drain or fill these transaxles. When checking or adding lubricant, the oil level should be at the bottom edge of the filler hole. When the case halves are separated, be sure to note the position of the vent tube. It is very important to make sure that the tube is properly positioned and doesn't become pinched when the case halves are reassembled. Using the correct lubricant at the proper level is important to the overall performance of the transaxle. Be sure to use the recommended AMC Jeep Renault gear lubricant or an equivalent grade GL5 lubricant with a viscosity rating of 75W90. For the 4-speed, the correct capacity is 3.25 liters. For the 5-speed, the capacity is 3.40 liters. Now, let's turn our attention to the disassembly procedures. For instructional purposes, we'll focus our attention on the JB1. Keep in mind, however, that the procedures for the JB0 are basically the same. Before the transaxle is removed from the vehicle, you should make a proper diagnosis to determine the problem. Be sure the clutch and linkage are properly adjusted. Then refer to the service diagnosis charts in the appropriate workshop manual. As we disassemble, inspect, and reassemble the transaxle, you'll need a number of special tools. Be sure you have each tool on hand before you perform the procedures. You'll also have to replace certain parts, such as oil seals, O-rings, and roll pins. Always use new circlips during the reassembly. Be sure you have the necessary parts to properly service the transaxle. The special tools, the parts to be replaced during disassembly, and the procedures we'll be covering are found in the JB Component Service Manual and IS Notes. The information contained in the IS Notes is especially important when servicing the JB0 and JB1. The transaxle removal and installation procedures are covered in your Renault Alliance and Encore workshop manuals. Specifications and torque values can be found in these reference sources, so keep them handy whenever you service the transaxle. Now, let's begin the actual disassembly. First, remove the end cover and seal. Next, engage first gear with the gear selector lever and fifth gear with the shift fork to lock up the gears. Remove the nut at the end of the primary shaft. Using a 3/16" punch, remove the fifth gear roll pin. Now, before you remove the synchronizer assembly, mark it as shown to ensure the correct positioning during reassembly. The fifth speed gear has been designed in two ways, with and without chamfer. To remove the fifth speed gear from the primary shaft, you'll have to first check the gear for chamfer. If the fifth speed gear has no chamfer, fit the special extractor tool into the slots in the fifth speed sliding hub. Then remove the hub, shift fork, and spring. Now, remove the synchronizer ring, fifth speed gear, roller bearing, bushing, and circlip. If the fifth speed gear is chamfered, you'll have to use a different special tool to remove the fifth speed gear. First, you'll have to remove the shift fork and outer synchronizer ring. Then, remove the gear using this special tool. Notice that some fifth gear shift forks may be fitted with separate pads. On other transaxles, however, the pads are part of the fork, as shown here. These selector forks and pads must be replaced together as an assembly. Continue the disassembly procedures by removing the secondary shaft circlip and Belleville washer from the secondary shaft. Note that some models use the circlip and Belleville washer, and other models use a combination of the circlip, washer, bolt, and spacer. To remove the fifth speed gear from the secondary shaft, use these special tools as shown if the fifth gear has no chamfer. If the fifth speed gear does have a chamfer, remove it using this special tool. Remove the reverse spring retainer, detent spring, and ball. Next, remove the fifth gear detent from the side of the gear case. This allows the selector to be disengaged from the selector shafts. Also, remove the fifth gear and reverse switches from the gear case. Now, remove the gear case retaining bolts from the final drive unit. As the case halves are separated, be careful not to lose the first, second, and third, fourth detent balls and springs. Remove the third, fourth selector fork roll pin by using a 3/16" punch. Repeat the procedure for the first, second selector fork roll pin. Note, however, that this pin can't be pushed all the way out. Push the pin out far enough to clear the selector shaft. Then, after the fork has been removed, the pin can be taken out. Now, make sure the transmission is in neutral. You won't be able to remove the selector shafts unless it is. Then, remove the third, fourth selector shaft by rotating it slightly as you move it up and out of the case. Also notice that the reverse shaft must be up in the neutral position to allow movement of the interlock pins. Remove the first-second selector shaft in the same way. When you remove the selector shafts, note the positions of the interlock pins. Then remove them from the case. Now, lift out the primary, secondary, and reverse shafts together. Before removing the gear shafts, you may want to install a bolt and socket on the secondary shaft, as shown here, to hold the gears on the shaft. As we mentioned earlier, the primary and reverse shaft gears can't be disassembled and must be replaced as a unit. Inspect the shafts and gears for wear and damage. If necessary, replace the complete shaft. The secondary shaft can be disassembled and serviced. But before we remove any of the components, let's take a look at them to see how they are assembled on the shaft. Note the location of the synchronizer assemblies. Also, notice that the second and third gears are held in place by circlips with a splined thrust washer on each side of the gear. Now, let's start the disassembly of the secondary shaft by removing the fourth gear flat washer, fourth gear, and blocker ring. To ensure correct positioning during reassembly, mark the position of the synchronizer hub and sleeve before removing it from the shaft. Be careful not to lose the synchromesh springs and rollers during disassembly. Next, disassemble the third and fourth gear synchronizer assembly. Now, we'll remove the third gear. It is held in place by a circlip and splined thrust washers. Remove and discard the circlip. Then, remove the splined thrust washer, third gear, and thrust washer below the gear. The second gear is removed in the same way. The next step is to remove the first-second synchronizer assembly. Remove the second gear blocking ring. Then, mark the position of the synchronizer hub and sleeve as we did earlier to ensure proper reassembly. Remove the synchronizer sleeve and be careful not to lose the synchronizer springs. Continue by removing the circlip and synchronizer hub as shown. Complete the secondary shaft disassembly by removing the first gear and the blocking ring. That completes the disassembly of the secondary shaft. Now, inspect each component for damage. Look for broken, chipped, or worn teeth. Inspect the blocking rings for wear and broken teeth. Check the condition of the synchronizer springs and rollers. Replace any parts which aren't acceptable. Now, the secondary shaft and gears can be reassembled. The reassembly is done in the reverse order of the disassembly. During reassembly, there are a couple of important points to remember. First, be sure to install new circlips. Use a pair of pliers, as shown, to prevent the circlip from twisting. Install the circlips so the end gaps are positioned away from the slots in the synchronizer hubs. When installing the synchronizer assemblies, be sure the springs are properly positioned. For the first-second synchronizer, the tail of the springs must face up as shown. The springs in the third-fourth synchronizer assembly must face down. When the reassembly of the secondary shaft is completed, place the shaft aside with the primary and reverse shafts for later installation in the case. Now, let's look at the disassembly and inspection procedures for the final drive unit. First, remove the drive shaft O-ring. Then, tilt the oil seal using a pin punch and a small hammer. Remove the oil seal using pliers. Be careful not to damage the side gear splines. Using an arbor press, apply just enough pressure to the case to compress the Belleville washer. Then remove the circlip. With the circlip removed, the final drive unit can then be pressed out of the case. Note the large Belleville washer on the final drive, which keeps thrust on the circlip. Proceed by removing the speedometer drive gear and Belleville washer. In some units, you may also encounter a spacer being used with the Belleville washer. If the unit you're servicing does use a spacer, be sure and install it during the reassembly. To disassemble the differential, remove the circlip from the center of the differential. Also, remove the washer beneath it. Continue the differential disassembly by removing the side gear, pinion shaft, pinion gears, thrust washers, and remaining side gear. Inspect each of these components to make sure they're not chipped, damaged, or worn excessively. Replace any damaged parts which aren't serviceable and reassemble the differential. Next, install the speedometer drive gear and the large Belleville washer. As the speedometer drive gear is installed, check the driving lug on the gear to make sure it's located in the notch in the differential housing. When installing the Belleville washer, position it so that the inner lip faces the bearing in the final drive housing. The differential, secondary shaft, and primary shaft bearings can be serviced. Inspect these bearings and replace them as necessary. The removal procedures will be covered in the reference book that is included with this film. That completes the disassembly. Now let's begin the reassembly process. We'll start with the final drive unit. Install the differential in the case. Apply pressure on the case until the circlip can be installed. Use only new circlips during the reassembly. Check to make sure the circlip is fully engaged. The oil seal is installed on the drive shaft using a special tool. Then install a new O-ring over the oil seal. Now, install the primary, secondary, and reverse shafts in the case. All three shafts must be installed together. Then install the reverse interlock pin in the case. To install the first-second selector shaft and fork, first coat the interlock pin with petroleum jelly to hold it in place. Then install it in the shaft. Raise the reverse shaft and hold it in position as shown. Now install the shaft and fork. Use a new roll pin. Next, install the 5th and 3rd 4th selector shaft interlock pins in the case. Coat the pins with petroleum jelly to keep them in the case. Again, the reverse gear shaft must be held in the uppermost position. Install the 3rd 4th selector shaft and fork. Then install a new roll pin in the fork. To install the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 4th detent balls and springs, place two 11/32" sockets as shown to hold the balls and springs in place so they won't drop down into the case. Now install the gear case to the final drive assembly. The gear selector lever must be in neutral. Apply a sealer such as Perfect Seal to the gear case mating surfaces and assemble the case halves. The case bolts are installed next. Tighten them to the specified torque. Then install the reverse detent ball and spring. To do this, fabricate a piece of wire into a hook. Insert the hook through a square oil feed hole and lift the reverse shaft up. Now the detent ball, spring, and clip retainer can be installed. The next step is to install the 5th gear detent, 5th gear, and reverse switches. Tighten the switches to the specified torque. Continue by installing the fifth gear and retainer on the secondary shaft. Install the gear with the boss toward the bearing. Install the Belleville washer using the special tool. Also install a new circlip. To seat the circlip, tighten the nut on the special tool. Check the circlip to be sure it's seated. On some models, you may need to install a combination of the circlip, a spacer, and bolt in place of the circlip and nut. The fifth speed blocker ring, gear, and washer are installed on the primary shaft next. Be sure to position the washer so that its boss is toward the bearing. Now, install the fifth gear synchronizer assembly and fork. Use Loctite 271 on the secondary shaft and synchronizer assembly. A new roll pin should be installed in the fork. Engage reverse and fifth gears to lock up the gears. Then install the nut on the primary shaft and the bolt on the secondary shaft. Tighten each with the specified torque. Complete the reassembly procedure by installing the end cover and seal. That completes our look at the JB0 and JB1 manual transaxles. You've seen the design features that make these transaxles unique, plus had a look at the procedures you should follow when disassembling and servicing the JB0, JB1 manual transaxles. It was a lot of information to cover, so we've detailed all this and more in the reference book that accompanies this film. Remember, the most comprehensive source of information is contained in these workshop manuals and IS notes. In addition to these publications and viewing this film, try to attend the next AMC Jeep Renault training course held in your area. You'll find these courses to be a valuable source of hands-on training.